Welcome, everybody, to today's panel on the behavioral shift, organized by the Becker-Friedman Institute for Research in Economics. My name is Melissa Tartari. I am a lecturer here at the Economics Department. I'm going to spend a few words about the Institute, and then I'll introduce you to the students who have organized the panel. The Becker-Friedman Institute builds upon the extraordinary tradition of Chicago economics and the famously vibrant culture of challenge and debate that it has long characterized it. Through programs like today's panel, as well as over 20 conferences and 20 visitors annually, the Becker-Friedman Institute is cultivating the next generation of economists and fostering the impact of economic analysis through ongoing engagement with those in the public, corporate, and nonprofit sectors, both nationally and globally. It is important to stress that this panel has been organized from beginning to end by economics undergraduate students here on campus. So it is with pleasure that I'm going to introduce you to our two student moderators. The first moderator is Nicole Gorton. She's a fourth-year econ major, so she'll be leaving us soon, unfortunately for us. Fortunately for her, she'll be joining the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the fall in research on the real side. And while in New York, she actually plans to run the marathon right this fall. The second student moderator is Alex Foster. Alex is a third-year econ major. He's also a creative writing minor, and he enjoys making short movies, or short films, I should say. He will be working during the summer in Ghana for Innovation for Poverty Action on a project contracted by the World Bank. Specifically, we'll be studying ways to foster female entrepreneurs. I also wanted to thank our two student organizers, I always forget his name, Dania Roberts and Cameron Taylor. They have worked really hard for several months to organize this panel. So with no further ado, I leave the stage to Nicole and Alex. Thank you very much for being here today.
We're incredibly grateful to the Becker-Friedman Institute for its continued support of undergraduate economics programs. To name a few of these, the Friedman Forums, the Research Experience for Undergraduates, and this yearly undergraduate organized panel. All of these events allow undergraduate students to connect with faculty, learn research tools, and interact with world-renowned experts.
We'd also like to thank all the people who helped us prepare for today's event, Professors Victor Lima, Grace Chang, and Melissa Tartari, and everyone at the Becker-Friedman Institute. Finally, thank you all for being here in the audience with us today. My name is Alex Foster.
And I'm Nicole Gorton, and we'll be moderating today's panel on the behavioral shift, how behavioral economics is affecting traditional analyses. So to help us parse through some of these questions, we have three experts with us today. So first, sitting to my left, we have Professor Colin Kammerer, who's the Robert Kirby Professor of Behavioral Finance and Economics at the California Institute of Technology. He earned his PhD and MBA at the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business, and his research focuses mostly on behavioral and experimental economics, for which he earned a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2013.
Professor Andrew Kaplan is the Silver Professor of Economics at New York University and co-director of the NBER Behavioral Macroeconomics Group. As an economic data engineer, Professor Kaplan heads the Kavli Human Project to design new measurements for human behaviors, biology, and environment in order to better understand how people act. Professor Kaplan earned his PhD at Yale University.
Professor David Laibson is the Robert I. Goldman Professor of Economics and the chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He additionally heads Harvard's Foundations of Human Behavior Initiative, where his research on behavioral economics focuses on aging, macroeconomics, intertemporal choice, and household finance. He earned his PhD at MIT.
On behalf of the students, Nicole and I are delighted to welcome you all to the University of Chicago. Thank you for being here with us today. So before we move on to some presentations from you about each of your own work, we want to begin today's panel by getting a clarifying definition on the table. So to begin, economics has always aimed to study human behavior. Gary Becker, who is one of the namesakes for our research institute here, was famous for applying economic approaches to all too human behaviors, such as addiction and child rearing. So with that in mind, how does each of you define behavioral economics, particularly in relation to economics in general?
I'm going to show you my definition in a minute, but a previous definition is it studies the limits of willpower, self-interest, and computation using psychological methods and ideas, typically, while respecting the traditional strengths of economics, which is formal analysis and talking about things in the world and policy.
I think that it is economics. I'm not sure that I know where the line is, and I think Gary Becker in many ways was a pioneering behavioral economist. I'd have no trouble saying that. And it's not really defined, I think, by, I think it's defined more by the method, where you're willing to be open to psychological phenomena that really were too much ignored. And Becker certainly was, and I think that we on stage are, and various others were. So you just, it's too much ignored, and now you go and measure and work with them, but you don't work with them very differently than others would have worked with them, ultimately. It doesn't change the field that much in that sense.
I completely agree. So you take classical economics with its emphasis on individuals making optimal decisions. You work inside that paradigm, mostly. And what you do is you try to improve some of the assumptions about motivation and cognition, but you're essentially still inside the optimization individual choice paradigm.
Great. We'll dig deeper into those, but with the basic definition of your field, behavioral economics, in mind, we'd now love for you each to present on some of your own work. So Professor Kammerer, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I would. Okay. So I'm going to try to revisit what we just talked about and also give kind of an exemplar of an area of work that I've worked on and others involving a type of game theory. So as just to echo what we've just heard, we see it as essentially an expansion of rational choice theory to include psychological factors. And we don't draw a sharp line between economics and other things, but nor between psychology and sociology, ideas from computer science, anything that's helpful. We often distinguish, David said, motivation and cognition between preferences, things people want and which we typically aren't necessarily regarding them as mistakes. Three classes that have been studied quite a bit are reference dependence, sociality, and variants of discounting models like beta delta. Other things I would think of as mental processes or cognition, and this is where you might actually see kind of mistakes or limits to rationality in how people are thinking. So some of the topics people have made a lot of progress on include learning, that either preferences and computations aren't made instantly without thinking. They're learned by trial and error. A lot is known about that from animal literature. Cognitive hierarchy, level K approach to game theory, I'll talk about more. That's why it's in bold. There are a number of interesting effects having to do with information projection. Like I know something and it's hard for me to imagine other people don't know it, or the way around. Attention is something Andy has worked on, and David too, that a lot of people in macroeconomics and other fields, including marketing, consumer behavior, have been thinking about how to model that using essentially a psychological concept of scarce attention. There's a concept from computer science called sparsity, which is used to think about how what's left out when we think about a model of the world and how big a mistake that would be, how models are updated. And efficient coding is, I think, is going to be a very promising way. That's why my slide says coming to think about lots of heuristics and biases, which previously have been a little bit unamenable to kind of nicely formalizing and packaging. Okay, important. We, meaning the three of us and most of the peers we think about in behavioral economics, try to maintain traditional emphasis on formal modeling. And by maintain emphasis, that means so many of my papers won't have these particular things in it, but we would prefer to be at conferences where models are then repurposed and used and applied in a formal way, so we know what we're talking about, so we have a clear idea. We're interested in predicting and explaining natural data, not just lab data, or usually a mixture, like you'll see today from me. We do care about markets and institutions, right? Most of behavioral economics, and particularly neuroeconomics now, is really interested in getting the model of human nature and cognition right, but that's kind of in service of then asking about trade and political elections and things like that. And I'm not particularly interested in policy because a tremendous number of talented people in universities and also in governments are worrying about this now. This has been a big, very rapid application area to ideas in behavioral economics and psychology. Okay, so a kind of exemplar topic. This is an introduction to the way I do things, and partly behavioral economics in general, is called a cognitive hierarchy approach to games. And I'm going to show you 4 types of data very quickly. Field data from a lottery, field data from movies, lab data. I'm not going to show you any data. I'll just show you a machine and talk about it, and lab data from the brain. So in Sweden, in 2007, for several weeks they ran a lottery we called Loopy. They called it Limbo. And the idea was that you'd fill out a card like this one. This particular card, if you paid €1 for each number, you could pick up to 6 numbers. So if you had €6, you could fill out 6 numbers on a card, and you could, of course, buy lots more cards. And the way the lottery worked was everybody would play. You would choose a number from 1 to 99,999. That's because that's how many things it could fit on the card. And the lowest unique number would win €10,000. Okay? Now, if you think about this, it's pretty easy to think about how to pick a low number. It's a lot harder to think about how to pick a unique number. A low number just means you know what's high and low, which children and even chimpanzees can learn. But figuring out what other people will pick, being unique, being anti-conformist, then you need to kind of think strategically about other people, and maybe about other people thinking about other people, and then we're in the interesting realm of game theory. So it turns out this is actually a very difficult game to solve, but if you assume the number of players actually is not the same every time, because they play this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and if you assume the number of players has a Poisson distribution, thanks to Roger Myerson, your brilliant professor here, then you can actually solve the game more easily. So it's a rare case in which the game's actually more complicated because there's not a fixed number of opponents, but the mathematics then becomes easier. Just an amazing phenomenon. So we borrowed Roger's magic, and it turns out that you can solve for what's called a mixed equilibrium. And a mixed equilibrium is when each player has a probability of choosing particular numbers. They're not just going to pick one number all the time, roughly speaking. And the equilibrium solves this beautiful equation, which, if you look at the bottom of the screen, which Ostling and Wang figured out, not me. I would even say check the proof, but I didn't check the proof. The referees did. Okay, so this is data from the first 1 week of people actually playing this game. On the left, you see the full range of numbers from 0 to 100,000. And the dotted line is the Poisson-Nash equilibrium based on Meyerson's insight and fancy math. And you can see the theory predicts you should only pick the lowest 5,000 numbers, the lowest 5%. Nobody should pick above 5,000. They basically designed the game wrong, right? They wasted numbers because they didn't they didn't do the math. On the right, we're going to take the lowest 10,000 numbers, forget about the 90% of the highest ones, and we're going to plot those. So you can see a lot of people picked low numbers. So the most common number is somebody thinking, let's see, I need to pick a low number that's unique. 1. No one's going to think of 1. Or maybe they're a little smarter, like 4. 4, who would think of 4? They're all busy picking 1. Ha, ha, ha. And so it turns out the winners are numbers like 2,500. Okay? And so, however, the data has kind of 3 deviations from the theory. So the dotted line you see there is the Poisson-Nash theory. It basically says people should pick numbers from 0 to 5,000 almost equally often and then stop. And the dark line is what's called cognitive hierarchy theory. And in that theory, some people choose instinctive salient numbers, like lucky numbers. Some people thinking they're playing those people. That's called level 1. Level 2 thinks they're playing level 1 and level 0, and so on. And so as you go up this hierarchy, you're getting people who are doing more and more reasoning, and they're more and more likely to win. But at the bottom of the hierarchy are people who just, either they're not motivated, they haven't figured it out, they don't bother to go past the pick a low number to the, well, other people pick the same low number as me. They're not thinking game theoretically. And so if you fit that line, you get an average number of thinking steps parametrically if you kind of try to fit from the data a very precise form model of about 1.8 in this data, which matches what we see in a lot of lab experiments. In the upper right there, you see an experiment we did at UCLA. We couldn't do it with 53,000 people in Sweden, so we scaled it down. And we had 26 people picking numbers from 1 to 99. And there, the dotted line is, again, the prediction of the equilibrium. It's the same concept. It's just the numbers are different because the game is shrunk. And the data fits quite well. OK, now let's go to the field. This is my namesake, Colin Farrell. It's my middle name. Not often mistaken for him. Once I was in Israel once, and a cab driver leaned in and looked at my ID and said, Colin Farrell, oh, actor, oh, the actor. He started to laugh. Thank you. That movie was a sleeper movie. It wasn't a big hit. But you notice there's 2 differences between these movies, at least more than 2 differences besides Colin Farrell. On the one on your left, you can see there's reviews quoted. The reason is they send it out to critics in time for them to watch it and write a review and get it in the Friday newspapers. And for the critics to be able to supply quotes that they would use to promote the thing. On the right side, no quotes. The reason is no critics were allowed to see it. That's called a cold opening. Now, if you think about the logic of game theory, if studios don't show the worst movies to critics, the fact that there's no quotes in the ad is information, right? That if you have a model of what studios are doing, it tells you that they probably didn't show it to critics because it's really bad. And so even though I don't see any reviews, the lack of a review is news. No news is bad news. So this is a histogram from Metacritic, which averages lots of different critic ratings. And you can see the average, these are thousands of movies. The average is beautifully Gaussian, right? There's a big spike at 40 to 60. Those are the average movies. And the red ones are the ones that are cold opening. Those are ones that were not shown to critics in advance. And so naive moviegoers who think, oh, I don't see any quotes on this ad for The Killers, and that doesn't mean anything. Maybe they forgot to print them, or I don't think that means anything. They might mistakenly think, gee, if I don't see anything, that's probably a quality 50 movie, an average. The strategic moviegoers will know, they may even have kind of a map in their head like this picture, and they know that if there's no cold opening, it might be a 20 to 40, or it might be a 0 to 20. Half of the 0 to 20s, including Killers, by the way, are cold opens. Okay, so now the next question is, can we say something empirically in data about what this phenomenon will mean? Well, you can show mathematically that if some of the people don't realize that studios are showing the worst, are failing to show the worst movies, and they act like those movies are just average, they're not, then there'll be a kind of box office premium. Too many people will go to see the big movies on the opening weekend. And so if you run a regression, this is a regression of box office grosses logged against all kinds of control variables, leaving out Metacritic ratings. You can see that there is a correlation between box office residuals on the y-axis and ratings. Higher rated movies do better, but it's quite noisy. You know, there's blockbusters critics don't like, and there's sleepers that critics love and people don't go see. But the main thing is that the red dots are above the blue. The red dots are the cold openings. And you can see that controlling for later quality, as it is later rated, these cold open movies do better. They do about 10% better. And those are people who are being fooled because they're not making the correct inference about the quality. Two more quick things. Another tool we've used to study this kind of limited strategic thinking is called eye tracking. You basically show the paths in a game on a screen, and you record using a camera where people are looking, or you can use a cruder version using a mouse. And a number of studies going back to the early 90s to recently have shown that when people are doing not very much strategic thinking, they're not looking at, say, the other player's payoffs at all. They're not bothering to compute what would another person do by building a kind of model. And finally, there are 4 studies here showing activity. These are 4 different studies involving games using brain imaging. And in all 4 of these, they happen to show activity in a region called dorsal or prefrontal cortex, which is involved in what's sometimes called prepotent inhibitions. So if there's something you want to do, like eat a delicious food, and you're exerting willpower, it may be in a region like this. And so this is just a glimpse, one slide, 4 studies, of how we might use brain imaging to kind of see where the mental processes are in a model like the cognitive hierarchy. Thanks. Oh, and you can ask me about these other weird things.
So I'm going to talk to you about my version of a behavioral shift because I think each one of us does it uniquely, but there are very strong common elements, and I'll try to weave those in a little bit. And to do so, I basically tell you what I think economics is first, as a process. And my vision, really what I'm trying to get across, is that behavioral economics is just an amended process of research. There's a regular process of research, throw in a couple of amendments, and you can call it behavioral economic research. Okay, so ideal research, I think, goes through 4 steps, roughly, and I'm now just quoting the canon of doing things sensibly. You start off, you're interested in some phenomenon in the world, and you think that there are some factors and some forces in play. And your intuition tells you that maybe part of why we choose things is kind of because we like them. It's not the most crazy first thought. And part of why we choose things and don't choose things might be because we didn't notice them. So it's kind of my intuition tells me a few things, and some of these are so universal that you can hardly imagine thinking about decisions without them. But that was intuitive. I didn't say I could tell you that I chose it because I liked it. You model what those forces are and how they would play out in some behavior of interest to you. choice behavior. You go around, you gather data. You find some data that says, look, I looked at people in this situation, and it looks like they followed the intuition, roughly, because it aligned. And then even better, you find out it didn't work. Much better. You find out that your theory had some flaws, and you were able to go back and say, you know what, I made a few mistakes, but I got some insights, and now I'm going to move forward and refine. And then the idea is you loop through, say, I wonder why that happened. And here we go, new factor. All right. So what happens when you're doing when I'm doing behavioral economic research? Well, I particularly want to think about forces that I've written them about as broadly as you could write them. Neglected psychosocial or biological forces. There's no limit to what you could imagine was playing in. And you could say it was a craving coming up from my body. You could say something happened to me that made me think I couldn't not do it. I felt obliged. All these kind of words we use, they're forces, and you watch them and say, well, maybe that's not in my earlier model. So it's a neglected force. I feel it's going to play out where? Well, I think it's going to play out in some behavior. And I'm going to model how it plays out. And now you get to something that Colin kind of produced. I may model how it plays out not only in the choice, but in the information you gathered beforehand. So Colin showed you that he sometimes tracks whether a piece of information was even looked at, let alone the basis for a decision. So that seems sensible. I can't see what's wrong with that if you're trying to think about how did information affect my decision. You should notice that they didn't gather the information, and that gives you a strong theory about how that information impacted their decision. You then think about enriched data. So now, and again, Colin just said, OK, I'm perfectly happy gathering this enriched data on where people look. No problem with that. Then you test, reject. Please reject, because we know we're wrong. OK, just reject, move on, get to the next thing. OK, and loop through. All right, and I'm going to do it by giving you two personal examples of things that I've thought about that kind of went this way. And one of them was in avoiding anxiety. So my personal introduction to wanting to do behavioral economics was noting that sometimes I did things like to avoid anxiety, like showing up early for a taxi. I could do that. But in my case, it wasn't from a taxi. It was because I noticed, as my life played out, that there were important questions I'd failed to ask. And I asked myself why I had failed to ask them. And I realized it's because I didn't want to know the answer, which struck me as totally reasonable. And therefore, avoiding information because it might cause disorganization or make you anxious seems to be a perfectly good thing to think about. Maybe I wouldn't neglect my finances for that reason. It's anxiety-inducing. Maybe I'd neglect my body. Yes, indeed could. And noticing and thinking that through, that anticipatory feelings, those things that come on ahead of a decision, weren't really being modeled in, and therefore you couldn't capture their impact on decision-making. But if it's true that they're there, then they're there, and they're playing out. So you'd like to capture them. Built models with John Leahy of that phenomenon called psychological expected utility theory, and now it can be applied. You can look at Gary Becker and Jona Rubinstein actually said, let's play that out in behavior and let's see fear of terrorism give rise to excessive avoidance of public spaces, kind of really as if the probability of damage was extremely high. And a policy application, protocols for effective medical testing. You don't want people to be so frightened that they won't test. And you can think about how you might induce men to stop neglecting their health and go get a checkup. And these are things one knows about personally. An issue, and I want to point out where measurement suddenly comes in. It's not so easy to measure anxiety. So you built that model, and it was really enjoyable to model it, And you wonder, I wonder where that plays out in behavior. And suddenly the anxiety part of it disappears and you get choices again, unless you're Colin. The best measurement I've seen of anxiety was by Colin and co-authors on clock games. And they actually tried to measure skin conductance and anxiety in a real decision. But because it's hard to measure, it's a challenge to reject and move on with the rest of the modeling. And I want to talk therefore to the second example I'd like to bring up, which is attention. Now, this one is a little closer to what you can imagine, as Colin was saying. In every form of behavior that I've ever seen, the best description of what people do is what they did yesterday. Kind of, it's just inertia, it's a pattern, this is what I do. And you say, why? Well, it's because of what I do. I don't know what you're saying. If you think more about what that says modeling terms, it's kind of fascinating. It says there's a big gap between what you could be doing potentially and what you are doing because you seem to be stuck in place. So what are you doing? What parts of the world are you taking in? Seems like a very valid question. We don't score perfectly on tests. We're not doing that on purpose. It's like, it's hard. So taking things in isn't so easy. And now we've got lots of models of that. The models, actually, you can pick many of them off the shelf. We've got search costs, cost of information processing, bounded rationality, queues, many things that deal with when you might and when you might not take data in, but take information in. But here now, the data challenge is very profound. When I see somebody make a choice, does it make it the best? Unconditionally, the best they identified, what they believed to be best, good enough given their constraints, or what? And now the question of how to enrich data becomes a key part of behavioral economics in my version. And you've got Mouse Lab, you've got eye tracking, you've got neural data, and I'm with two of the leaders in the extended measurement. And we have very interesting identification problems. Why do I consider myself data engineering? Because I think that this measurement challenge is very profound and general. That is, we keep on wanting to have new forces that are playing out in behavior. But if in the end what we say about the behavior is that after all that extremely long and intricate thinking, you picked an apple over an orange, I mean, there's an embarrassment of riches. There's a bazillion reasons you could pick an apple over an orange. It's too limited a funnel. And there's a very nice theory which is introduced a data set I personally like very much, state-dependent stochastic choice data, in which it basically goes as follows. I'm holding an object. The heavier object is in one of my two hands. You place them there so you know which one is heavier, and you ask me which is heavier. And I make lots of mistakes. You knew where the good object was. You saw me make mistakes. You recorded the pattern of my mistakes as a function of reality. So the state of the world impacted the pattern of errors I made. You got insights into attention as a result. Same thing can happen if you're trying to measure, does a sales tax affect demand? Does it get noticed? So noticing is a very interesting thing. And the last thing I'd like to say is, very interesting set of applications for you all to think about, which is test design, which seems to me that it's testing some very funny things that it didn't want to be testing. Like, are you good at time allocation strategy? How anxious are you about guessing? And you can think of 20 things that go into every test answer you give, which aren't the measure of the skill that it was supposed to be measuring. So here's a case where opening your mind to what's actually going on in that decision to answer a test could lead to real improvement.
Thank you. Professor Leibson.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers for giving us this chance. I want to talk about behavioral economics and behavior change. I'm going to go very quickly. I'm going to tell you about 4 areas that have kind of motivated me during my career. I'll talk about intertemporal choice. I'll talk about household finance, and there I'll hit a lot of the behavior change. I'll talk about industrial organization and how a behavioral perspective changes the way we approach that. And then I'll talk about biosocial science, really the previous comments from Colin and Andrew already anticipated a lot of the issues as we get to the biological foundations of behavior. So first, intertemporal choice. What I have obsessed about the most since I got my doctorate has been something called present bias. And to boil away all of the Greek letters and get to the essence, it's the idea that stuff that happens right now gets full weight, and stuff that happens even in the near future gets only half weight. Let me show you an example that kind of illustrates how interesting and complex this makes the world. Suppose that you can exercise at an immediate cost of 6. You don't like exercising, it's effortful, at least it is for me. It's not a pleasure. But I get a delayed benefit, or so I'm told, that I'll be healthy. So there's this 8 coming later, you know, dribbling in over the next year. So when will I exercise if those are the costs and benefits and I have present bias, that weight of 1 on the present and weight of 1/2 on the future? Well, will I exercise today? Absolutely not. Very good prediction. -6 plus 1/2 8 equals -2. No exercise right now. But how do I feel today, Friday, about making a plan to exercise on the weekend? How do you feel about that plan in your own life? Sounds pretty good, right? So there's no immediate cost. That's a 0 today, Friday. Over the weekend, I'll pay a cost of 6. I'll get an even more delayed benefit of 8. They're both in the future, so they both get discounted by 1/2. Net payoff to me as I sit here on Friday making this plan +1. So in this world of present bias, I'm not going to exercise today, but I'm going to plan to exercise in the future. And I think you all see where that's going. Now, I've been thinking a lot about how this tendency to make plans that we're not going to carry out plays out in our lives. And the principal domain of application is the domain of household finance. And I want to talk about 2 kind of interesting ways it plays out. First, it generates procrastination. We'll see that in a second. And it also opens up ways for behavior change interventions. So first, procrastination. Let's think about surveying people and just asking them, are you saving enough? What are your plans for future saving, et cetera? It's all cheap talk, so we don't take it too seriously. But what do we learn, or what do we see in the data? Well, out of every 100 people that are surveyed, about 2 out of 3 say that they're not saving enough for retirement. And about 24 out of 100 say that they're going to save more in the future, in fact, in the next 2 months. And then we actually go to their administrative records and we check. We have their data from their employer, and we see whether they did, in fact, enroll in their 401k plan, which is what they're talking about here. But we give them 4 months, not 2 months. How many do you think actually have taken the action they said they would take 4 months after they made the report? Just 3. So we see this kind of predictable pattern of behavior. People know they have a problem. Many of them plan to solve the problem. Very, very few of them do. Now that opens up the door to interventions. And perhaps the most famous intervention is automatic enrollment in retirement savings plan, which was first studied by Bridget Madrian and Dennis Shea. I've joined Bridget, and collaborators James Choi and Andrew Metrick have done a series of follow-on studies. Let me quickly tell you how that works. Well, there's an undesired outcome, call it non-participation in the retirement savings plan, in the 401k plan. There's a desired outcome, which is joining the savings plan. And there's some seemingly trivial barrier to joining the savings plan, which might be a 30-minute enrollment process. And the idea of automatic enrollment is simply switching the starting point. So rather than starting as a non-participant and having to enroll, you start people as a participant and tell them if they don't like it, then they can unenroll, they can opt out. Now we'll see in a second the data. This trivial change makes an enormous difference in terms of behavior, because people essentially procrastinate in joining these plans, and they also procrastinate in opting out of these plans. Now, suppose you were a student or a faculty member at the University of Chicago, and you felt that all of this manipulation was inappropriate. We shouldn't unbalance the playing field. We should have a more libertarian orientation in our policies, and you wanted to kind of create a libertarian enrollment process for these savings plans. What would you do? I mean, if you have enrollment as the default outcome, that's biased. If you have non-enrollment as the default outcome, that's biased. So what alternative do we have? Is there any way to kind of try to get a more balanced playing field in designing these plans? Well, one answer is to take the 2 options and move them both onto the left-hand side of the hurdle and require that people choose for themselves. Now, that's obviously going to create more of a balanced playing field, This is called active choice, and we'll see as well that this kind of intervention makes a big difference, again, encouraging savings relative to opt-in regimes. Now, imagine that you don't like that kind of forced choice or active choice mechanism, and you again wanted to go into a world where you are giving people the option to enroll. And you live in a world where people procrastinate. What else could you do to help people get over the hurdle of enrollment and join these savings plans with all of their benefits, like matching dollars and tax benefits, et cetera? Well, if it takes 30 minutes normally for people to join these plans, you could take the 30-minute enrollment process and shrink it by giving people pre-populated forms and kind of check-a-box enrollment. And that's what we tried in this study. There's a co-author here, John Bashears, who's joining the team. We took the normal 30-minute enrollment process and made it a 30-second enrollment process. Now, in principle, that shouldn't make a difference because we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of retirement savings. How could a 30-minute enrollment process matter? Well, we'll see in a second that it does matter. Simply shrinking the cost of enrollment from 30 minutes to 30 seconds drives up the enrollment rate by 10 percentage points. So here's a kind of quick summary of the data. That's called quick enrollment. Quick summary of the data. When you tell people you're not enrolled in the savings plan, take 30 minutes and take the trouble to enroll if you want to, you get a 40% enrollment rate if you look at people 1 year after they've joined the firm. If you do one of these quick enrollment regimes, where you simply make enrollment easier, not 30 minutes but 30 seconds, you get a 50% enrollment rate. If you compel people to make a choice, active choice, you get a 70% enrollment rate. And if you automatically enroll people, if you automatically enroll people and you give them the chance to opt out, you get a 90% enrollment rate. So you see this vast difference in outcomes based on these seemingly trivial characteristics of the choice architecture. And so we're learning how to help people get to where they want to go by creating the right environment for making the choice. Well, I want to turn to two more topics. The first is industrial organization and the idea of thinking about a world where there are relatively rational firms interacting with consumers who are missing some of the elements of the environment. This is some work I've done with Xavier Gebex. We're studying shrouding, which is the idea that firms can kind of hide some of the follow-on costs of buying their product. So in the models that we're studying here, firms are going to offer a base good at a subsidized loss leader price. They're going to say you can, let's say, open up a bank account at no cost or even with a free gift. So they're basically subsidizing your opening of the account. And then they sell you highly profitable add-on services like minimum account violation, you pay $40. Minimum balance violation, you pay $40. Now we show this is an equilibrium because the consumers who are sophisticated want to pool with these naive consumers. Why? Because the sophisticates, let's say all of you, get the advantage of free checking, free ATM usage, all of the services of the financial service system without paying all of those add-on fees. So you want to pool with consumers who are making all those mistakes because by doing so, you're getting the loss leader pricing in the banking system. You're getting all of those free services, or maybe even you're getting paid for being a customer at these banks. Now, in other work, we're studying competition. This is work with Xavier and Dayun Lee and Hung-Yi Lee and Sid Resnick and Casper de Vries. And here we're looking at how noise affects equilibrium behavior. What we're finding is that if you add some noise to the choices that people make and you have them pick the kind of noise-inclusive best choice, competition ends up becoming much, much, much weaker. So the noise here is the epsilon on the right-hand side. There's a true value V. There's a price the firm charges P. And there's this perceived value U hat, which is noised up. We find that the markups in equilibrium, P minus C, are proportional to the noise divided by the square root of the log of the number of competing firms in the industry. Now that's good news. At least more competition means lower markups. But the bad news is that unlike our standard models where competition dramatically drives down markups to zero markups, in this world, as you increase competition, you only weakly decrease equilibrium markups. Now contrast that with the Cournot model, where as you increase competition, the markups fall in 1 over n, the number of competing firms. So in this world where there's noise and people are not quite getting things right, you see vastly less competitive pressure on prices. than you see in the kind of classical Cournot model that is the kind of benchmark model in our classes. Let me quickly turn to biosocial science and tell you about neuroeconomics and genoeconomics. So in neuroeconomics, we're learning, and Colin talked about this, about kind of how different parts of the brain seem to be associated with different kinds of behavioral patterns. We're learning that in the prefrontal cortex, there seems to be an association with self-regulation. In the medial prefrontal cortex, we're seeing a kind of integration region where lots of signals come together. And in the dopamine reward system, we're seeing a system that is more oriented towards immediate rewards or immediate costs. And we're able to kind of make those determinations by using neuroimaging. And some of this work is work that Colin's done with Heron Rangel, work that I've done with colleagues at Princeton. But we're noticing that in this prefrontal cortex here, we see self-regulation. And in these other brain regions, we're seeing patterns that are more associated with kind of impulsivity and desire for instant gratification. Now, the last topic I want to touch on is genoeconomics, which is the kind of relatively new science trying to map variation in the genome to variation in economic behavior. The paper I'm going to tell you about here by Akbe et al. Has over 100 co-authors. I'm one of them. But the key players here are the doctoral students who did the work, and Dan Benjamin and David Cesarini and Phil Collinger, who lead the Social Science Genetics Association Consortium. I'm on their advisory board. This study, just published in Nature a couple days ago, combined 63 data sets to produce a sample of 300,000 individuals. And this study found 74 genome-wide significant kind of variants in the genome that are associated with educational attainment. Now, to avoid multiple testing biases, we don't use the traditional alpha value of 0.05, the traditional cutoff for significance. We instead divide that cutoff by 1 million. So the alpha values in this study aren't 0.05, i.e. 5 times 10 to the negative 2. They're 5 times 10 to the negative 8th. Much, much more rigorous, demanding threshold for significance. When we do that, we find 74 variants on the genome that are associated with variation in educational attainment in the cross-section of people. Now, the effect sizes are plotted here on the left, and you'll see the effect sizes are minuscule. So what we're learning is there isn't a gene for being a high educational attainment person, but there's rather, in this case, 74, but as samples get larger, hundreds and thousands and millions of genes, of genetic variants rather, individual base pairs that vary in the population that are associated with educational attainment, each playing a very, very small role in explaining the population level heritability of these traits. Now, I want to emphasize it's not all about genetics. Genetics only explains a small part of the variation. Environment, of course, also matters a great deal, as well as the interactions between genes and environment. So that was a whirlwind tour of topics that have kept me up at night. I hope I didn't go too fast, and I'm eager to hear your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those perspectives. We'll certainly get to some of these topics later on in the panel. But before we do that, I want to address some fundamental issues in comparing behavioral economics to traditional economics, and more specifically with rational choice theory. So in our undergraduate economics courses, we learned that agents optimize subject to constraints, but behavioral economics is often seen as rejecting this premise. What does rationality mean to you, and how does your work as behavioral economists fit into this theory of rationality?
I was kind of poo-pooing this question because in our pre-game discussions, one reason is the word rationality. I mean, all of us understand it in this sense exactly as Nicole said, but it's used, say, in mental health in a particular way. Philosophers probably have 12 different, I mean, this is their game, like 12 different variations. And there may be in other fields it's used differently. So I would say, behavioral economics, one thing we're doing is to think about different types of constraints or exactly how the constraints work. So the constraints we're most interested in are not traditional ones, although we do appreciate those effects and we're always looking for them, like income effects and price effects. We're also interested in, say, attention. I mean, attention is clearly scarce. We've known that for a long time. It's not a radical claim. Jacob Marshak wrote about this and many other economists. And so only recently have economists come to be able to think about suppose attention is a scarce resource. Can we think of attention as being allocated optimally, maintaining the optimization part of the mathematics, which is what generates precision, and then weakening the implicit assumption of unlimited attention, but trying to do so in a sort of disciplined way. And I think that approach, which originated to a large extent actually in macroeconomics from Chris Sims, and Xavier Gabex and David did some work on this too, is going to see a kind of iteration from data to model to data to model. At least it should. It should. How much of that happens is up to the individual people and what problems are motivated and things like that. So I think that's a kind of canonical example of where the concept of rational, irrational should be kind of displaced by the concept of more and less attentive, where we have a very precise idea of what that means.
Yes, I don't find that I know what I mean when I say rational. So if I'm reflecting personally and saying, when I was anxious about something and made a decision for that reason, am I saying rational? So in fact, contemplating that was very interesting, and I think it's part of how you build the modeling. You say, well, I think this is playing out, probably playing out fairly coherently in my decisions. And the word rational is a shortcut for coherently following through on your assumptions. So in a way, the only person who really needs to be rational is the model builder, because you don't want to be confused about what you're modeling. So you spend your time trying to make sure that you are, at least I know what I'm doing, and in that sense, I'm rationalizing my vision of the data. And it turns out that to use the word maximization and throw in some constraints is so much easier than whatever else you were about to say if you're ever going to get to data. So it's just, if you're ever going to be wrong, you're going to have to tease it out with some assumptions. And if you allow yourself all the freedom of saying, well, it's much more complex than that. It's not, it's not that easy. Then no, it's not that easy. But neither will you reach a conclusion, and neither will you find out the limits of your thinking. So it's a way of coming up against your limits, is to go as far as you can with whatever motives and reasons you think about and the constraints, and then move on. And I do agree that there's a very interesting thing going on, which is the extent to which it's going to be biologic at some point in the future. Rationality, does that mean, well, I mean, the biological system's there. We're going to be taking that into account. When we're doing that, will we ask it to be rational? So it's a very interesting thing, what we're doing, and even there, you have fantastic debates about whether you should think that, who we are in a deeper sense comes about in part from evolutionary pressure, which means that it would be a very bad mistake when you're supposed to run to be so confused that you kind of go and embrace the danger. So there's a lot that says the system must have worked some of this stuff out right, and vision scientists are among the most profoundly committed to Bayesian rationality of anybody you'll see. There's a very interesting coming together within psychology and economics around these issues. There's going to be biology too. What we'll call rational at the end of that process, I have no idea.
So when I talk with my doctoral students about the word rational, I advise them never to use that word, at least not in public. Here's why. In the problems that we study in our classrooms, problems that are familiar to all of you, it's pretty clear what the rational action choice is. It's usually a relatively simple maximization problem. There's an optimum. You can find it. It's straightforward. But once you get out of these kinds of toy examples, the meaning of rationality becomes quite opaque. And you quickly come to the conclusion, at least I have, and I think a lot of behavioral economists have, that it's not even a well-posed concept. Let me give you an example. What does it mean to play chess rationally? Well, if you went to a kind of textbook game theory answer, you would say you got to backwards induct the tree from the end of every single game. Well, is that really what we want to mean by the word rational? Surely not. I mean, that's kind of a crazy definition. We're going to spend 1 billion years to make a move if we had all the computers in the universe. That can't be rational. But what do we mean by rational? Looking 20 moves ahead, some kind of pruning algorithm, looking 4 moves ahead? And once you start to kind of layer in all of the complexities of real-life decision-making, say in something as simple as a game of chess, which is not even as complex as anything that we're doing right now, you say, look, rationality is very hard to pin down. I mean, we can define it in certain settings, but we can't really define it generally. And so I tell my students, don't get caught in a debate about what is rational and what is not rational. Is looking ahead 15 moves in a chess game rational, or is that myopic? I don't know. But why do we care? What we care about is something totally different. We care about, as social scientists, whether we can write down models that do a good job at predicting things in the world, whether it's chess games or the moves of monopolists in a market or the moves of consumers saving for retirement 50 years away. We're writing down models. We're asking if those models correspond to reality in some sense. And we don't need to insert the word rationality in that discussion. We can simply insert the words explanatory power, additive sample, predictive accuracy, words like that. And so my advice to you is don't get hung up on whether the model you're writing down is rational or quasi-rational or pseudo-rational or myopic or whatever else. Simply ask yourself, is your model generating insights about the world, and does it offer some correspondence to the data? That's the ultimate test of the model's usefulness.
It definitely is at odds with what I've been told many times here at the university, which is to assume that agents are rational in making your models because professors believe that models which assume rationality are best able to predict people's behaviors. And so it has the same goal of just creating models that predict people's behaviors, but it uses a different assumption in order to achieve that goal.
There's always graduate school.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I'm wondering, is it just
Or the Fed.
So striking down rationality could be simply making the issue more complex and getting more at the heart of how people are behaving. But it could also be a direction to totally do things differently, and then whether you believe in rationality would be relevant. One thing that comes to mind is Professor Kaplan, you said in your presentation that you ask, and you wrote this, are people choosing the best option, or are they choosing the second best, or are they simply choosing good enough? I think that if we believe that our models have to have agents acting rationally, that question would be rephrased as, do we have the best understanding of what people are optimizing, or do we have an incorrect understanding? Is that a correct rephrasing?
That's a very key point, I think, which is that I think a model in which somebody's optimizing, if you're very open-minded about the way they're optimizing, can explain anything that you see, provided you say, I allow the optimization to include how much they knew at the time of making the decision. So let's go to that apple and that orange. This is a person who you know really likes apples. And they walk up to an apple and orange, and they pick the orange. And what's going on? Well, the apple was hidden. It was in a different part of the supermarket. Now, if I allow myself to open to the fact that I don't really know the mental, that's a very easy case. I could track them in the supermarket. But now think of a complicated decision like the ones David's talking about. Which savings plan? Do you know what I gathered information on in making that decision? You cannot. You don't know what I internalized. If you say I optimize subject to constraint, that's almost a truism. Yes, the constraint was that I didn't notice the better things. And so therefore I think the forces, and so a word in favor of optimization, it wasn't a mistake to pick I like stuff and I know stuff as the two fundamental constructs with which to explain decision making. That wasn't like what a whacked out error. When you're talking in conversation, it's very hard to talk to your child and say, why did you do that? They might want to say, kind of my algorithm gripped me. But you would say, I think that's because you wanted the cookie on it. Was it? No. So, okay, so we do go through those, and it's hard to imagine discourse without thinking of the motives. and without thinking of the constraints. What gets really hard is that we can't observe those constraints. So we'll end up looking at decisions and saying, I better find some other way. And it's not going to be that those constructs will be replaced. It's inconceivable to me. And maybe I'm just too limited in imagination. But I can't conceive of those objects being missing. I can conceive of them being enriched. But the exact enrichment is going to depend a little bit on the kind of additional data that you gather, because otherwise my words were too easy. It was too easy for me.
I think the key is not to lean on axioms like the model must be a rational actor model, otherwise it can't be the best model. That's an axiomatic approach to social science. We should instead ask, well, what set of assumptions generates maximal predictive power? And let go of litmus tests. There's no purity test of your model that occurs ex ante because you've made the acceptable assumptions. That was the way we did economics a while ago. Now, the way we do economics is we ask, to what extent is your model successful? And by success, we usually mean, does it make good predictions? And we don't prejudge whether the model is acceptable or not based on some abstract property like, is the agent perfectly Bayesian? Now, it may well turn out that the perfectly Bayesian agent is the one that generates the best predictive power given the particular data set we have. But we should let the data answer that question, not some ex ante purity test that precludes alternatives that may, in fact, be empirically useful.
If I could add one more thing about this. One of the other namesakes of this absolutely terrific institute, Milton Friedman, wrote an extremely influential book. If you're a serious economist, you should read it. It's not very long. And a lot of it, I think, will held up amazingly well, called The Methodology of Positive Economics. And one of the main points he makes in that book, I mean, the abridged Cliff Notes version is as if. Okay, you're done. The point he makes is, when we make an assumption like managers are motivated to maximize profits, assumption, and then we make predictions about, say, price markups and all kinds of things, that assumption could be technically incorrect, but it might still generate an approximately good prediction. And I think that's a very reasonable idea. But, and later in the passage he says, and by the way, if you want to suggest a better theory with a different assumption, that's great. But your theory has to explain all the things the old theories can say and then some. And so I think for the most part, that's what we always strive to do in behavioral economics. Okay, so I'll give a self-serving small example. One question you can ask is, if you take the cognitive hierarchy type of model as I thought about, are there cases in which Nash equilibrium, which probably all of you have learned in game theory, I hope you have, predicts behavior in experimental games or in auctions in the field or in disclosure games like movies? Is it the case that Nash equilibrium sometimes predicts really well and these cognitive models don't? And the answer is very rarely. And the reason we think is, you can divide games into two classes, as Drew Frudenberg and others have shown. And it's also a distinction that goes to Hall, Toeger, and Waldman and some of their very seminal papers in the 80s, which are kind of early behavioral economics 1.0. The distinction is between strategic substitutes and strategic complements, okay? And so a strategic substitute means if a bunch of people are picking the wrong strategy, I should pick the right strategy. So in the lowest unique integer game, if I know a bunch of people are stupidly picking numbers that are really low because they don't think about uniqueness, I can take advantage of that by thinking about uniqueness. And if games have that structure, a mixture of players at different levels of rationality will often approximate a Nash equilibrium. So one of the graphs I quickly showed you was student data from UCLA, where we played a scaled-down version of that lowest unique positive integer game. And within the first 7 plays, the data they produced was almost really, really closely approximated the Poisson-Nash equilibrium, which nobody had ever discovered before. And we couldn't even have computed it if it wasn't for Roger Myerson's brilliant idea. And so that, did they compute this equilibrium, write it down? No, they acted as if. Except the model that generates the as if is a cognitive thinking model. In other words, in that particular game, because of the strategic substitution, right, a mixture of people with different rationality are going to approximate everybody choosing the equilibrium. And there are a lot of examples like that, I think, where we do see sometimes remarkable adherence to, say, Bayesian-Nash rationality or optimization. And that may well come about because of trial and error learning, or because mixtures of rational agents are going to cancel each other out. The opposite case is called strategic complements. And in that case, if a bunch of people do things that are quite irrational, it may really pay for you to go along with them. And then you could conceivably get things like price bubbles out of equilibrium short horizons and things like that. You know, the bubbles are going to last for a long time, and even though I'd prefer to short them and make money, I'm not sure I can cover my short position before the quarter ends. And so the limits of rationality will actually kind of get amplified. And so that distinction gives you a little bit of leverage on when we expect to see rational-like results arising from limitedly rational humans and the other way around.
So it sounds like most of you are saying that behavioral economics is a complement to traditional as opposed to a substitute. So I'm kind of interested to hear how you would classify it. Is it a subfield of economics like labor economics? Is it a movement like neoliberalism? Or is it a tool like econometrics?
I think it's all there is to economics now, because we don't make too sharp of a distinction. You know, so in other words, when I think about behavioral game theory, we start with equilibrium concepts and rational expectations. We don't, you know, it's not as if we've junked the old methods, right? It's just that typically the same basic tools are being used, the concept of a game, classic concepts in macroeconomics, David's beautiful shrouded attribute papers, basically price theory with, you know, something of a complication about the fact that some prices are hidden to some agents. And then you do, you know, price theory 2.0.
I mean, I think that the way I see it very much is in terms of a research process. So it's not a type of music. It's like a way of making music. So if you think about you know, what makes the process, is kind of what I was writing down is that you're informed by something that came from outside the canon quite often. The canon starts and it's beautiful, and in fact the value of the canon in part is to show you the exceptions, because without the canon you can't, what's non-canonical? I mean, there's got to be something, and then you say, oh good, it was so tight there, it was so well constructed that I could see what didn't fit and feel it. And then from what doesn't fit, you kind of start the analysis from something new. And it's psychological, or it's something like that. And then, as I say, I think it's a back and forth between the idea and the evidence that's getting increasingly interesting, and that marks where we're heading. So it's a process, and it's a process that I think more and more are engaging in, whether they'd call themselves. I don't know whether at some point they'll say, I was doing that all along, and in a way, the only person, I mean, bluntly, I would say Gary Becker would have been okay saying, I was doing that all along, what are you talking about? And that would be fine. I don't think any one of us on this stage would object to Gary you know, being one of the founding fathers in a way. So it's just that process, I think.
I see it as a sort of add-on. I see classical economics as this extraordinarily productive, useful, insightful body of knowledge. I am in awe of the line of contributions that I think of as starting with Adam Smith and continuing through, you know, the modern high water marks like the contributions that have been made right here in Chicago. And I think that sometimes you want to take that extraordinarily productive body of insights and add an additional element that makes it a little bit better. And often the classical work just stands on its own and you don't need to add anything to it. It's just right. But sometimes you want to change the preferences and make them a little more psychologically realistic, or change the cognitive process and introduce a cognitive hierarchy model of the sort that Colin has developed. So think about it as analogous to game theory. Often, it's okay to just study competitive equilibrium and completely ignore strategic interaction. You can just treat everyone as sufficiently small in a large group of agents that the competitive equilibrium is fine. But sometimes you want to amend that by introducing strategic interaction. Well, likewise, think of classical economics as this kind of benchmark model that often is enough. But sometimes you want to introduce the complexities that come from the psychological stuff. And that's when you add behavioral to the classical mix. Often it's not appropriate to add it. The classical model essentially gets things right. As Colin emphasizes, often if you play a game again and again and again, and you get feedback and everyone's learning and you're studying the 33rd round of play, Nash equilibrium is just right. But if you're studying the first round of play, and it's a complicated game, or it's just not a trivial game, Nash equilibrium is not going to be just right. And so you need to ask yourself, am I interested in the 33rd round of play of highly experienced subjects in a kind of uniformly experienced population, or am I interested in the first round of play? And that's when the behavioral stuff starts to get interesting. So I do see it as an add-on, sometimes appropriate, sometimes not appropriate.
Great. We wanted to change the tempo a bit and do a couple quick question and answers. So first, what do you think is the most robust result that behavioral economics has to its name?
Well, I think there's some things from psychology that haven't been explored too much that are very robust. One is hindsight bias. When you look at meta-analysis of hindsight bias refers to the fact that after an event occurs, people recall themselves as having thought ex ante it was more likely than it really was. It's pretty robust. It's hard to debias. I mean, it still grabs me. That and sunk cost fallacy, which is the tendency to ignore sunk costs that should be ignored, haven't been studied in kind of modern behavioral economics quite so much. And it's possible that there are institutional or technological fixes. In the case of hindsight bias, it may be that if you just have clear enough records of what people thought or said on emails or were looking at on TV, before a disaster occurs, that would prevent people from saying, oh, you should have known the disaster would occur, which currently happens. Those are two that are, and also what I have in mind is meta-analytic results, where if you look at dozens of studies, and you try to estimate how reliable the effect is, and whether it varies a lot across different types of people, you can have interesting effects that do vary, and they go away, or they go. But those effects are unusually robust.
So I would go for thoughtlessness. There's so many settings in which it seems clear, lining up the incentives, that we should be thinking about them, and we don't. And that gives rise to a stunning ability that we each have to be manipulated by somebody pointing something out to us that was perfectly obvious, or somebody making something green that, why did I go for that thing over there? So every single day we're affected by things that are so casual relative to what should be affecting us in the theories, that it's so everyday robust. Every choice we make, we sit there, and if I were to describe the choices I made today, they'd be stunningly strange. If you thought was that the best among all the options you could think of? You say, dude, I wasn't thinking. I mean, and that goes for so many things, and sometimes I could say it's motivated by things like anxiety. Well, it would make me anxious to think. Sometimes it just comes out of status quo bias. I mean, whatever I was doing yesterday, I'm doing it today. But it doesn't get more robust than that, I think. I mean, and then there are beautiful behavioral effects, and I think there are studies, and David was talking about them, that, why is that able to change somebody's behavior? They should have been thinking.
That's a really hard question. So I like Andrew's answer, that there's a degree to which some things we see and we're responsive to, they're often immediate, they're often now, they're often in our visual frame, they're called out to us, and somehow they weigh heavily in our analyses. And the things that are out of sight, out of mind, further away in time, they tend to get downweighted. And I think a lot of the important biases that really drive profound deviations from what we would consider a kind of classical benchmark of normative behavior are when we kind of overweight the stuff that's here and now, that's salient, that's clear, that's in our face, and underweight the thing that's being hidden, maybe intentionally by someone trying to trick us. I mean, we should be able to infer, this gets back to Colin's point, when the review is not released before the opening, you're not thinking about why the review was not released before the opening and realizing that there's adverse selection going on. And it's this world of hidden things that we don't recognize or fully understand, fully weight, that I think organizes a lot of the mistakes that we're making relative to these normative benchmarks.
Yeah, let me add one quick example. It's a hometown. So we think of the movie disclosure thing as maybe falling in an interesting category of, there's a famous Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that didn't bark. And it turns out the dog didn't bark because it knew the owner, and that was the key. And so, sometimes it's kind of it's hard to attend to non-information and then make a proper inference. That seems like a particularly diabolical lapse. And Kelly Shue in the Booth Business School here has a beautiful finance paper on this, where it turns out that if you're a regulatory arbitrageur and you're worried about an M&A deal taking place, as time goes by and there's no news about the deal taking place, it means it's less likely to take place. And she shows that the markets don't reflect that. They seem to not be pricing the lack of news, even though lack of news actually is news. But it's, in other words, it's what's not in the Wall Street Journal. And by definition, there's a lot that's not in the Wall Street Journal. So you can see how this is a very interesting type of and plausible cognitive lapse, even among very, really talented people who spend a lot of time looking at screens. Looking at the screens is not going to solve this problem. Right, and so that's an example of a behavioral finance kind of gem where, a particular cognitive force, shows up in very high stakes markets, of which there are many examples in finance as well.
What is the next field or topic within economics that behavioral insights haven't been applied to that you think could benefit a lot from those insights?
Ooh.
Well, I would go for, and this is because of my definition. So I might have a different slant. And my definition said kind of it's a method. And if you take that method part of it, then the method is a lot of it's going to focus on what data you can begin to gather. And in fact, as you liberate additional data, you'll liberate additional thinking. So my take would be the flow is going to go from the mass of data that we can get hold of to the ways in which we'll think about it, rather than our a priori thoughts would lead us down that road. Take the case of genes. There's going to be fascinating stuff happening in the interaction between biology and behavior. Now, how are we going to call that behavioral? Yeah, well, it's definitely an expansion of the type of data and the type of modeling that will be called for, whether it will be, again, I have to say that the most useful model I found for handling a particular genetic question was Gary Becker, an addiction model. But as we incorporate biology into behavior, some of the constraints that we see in the behavior, it might be that you actually got hijacked by your short-run self, and one could actually say, I can see that. And there's suddenly that's part of my, and now that's not outside the theory, it's inside the theory. So I think that I would go for the biology interacting with behavior is going to be a massive field. And I don't know exactly how we'll be modeling it.
I have two thoughts about this, which is, one is labor economists tend to study sort of highly aggregated features of labor markets, and it's been quite a successful field. And but a lot of what goes on in labor markets is the actual work people perform in organizations, and that's sometimes called organizational economics. And it's a field that doesn't make much contact with studies of sociologists and people in organization behavior. And so I think behavioral economics could say things about the nature of work and satisfaction, whether, what does it mean to like your job or like the people you work with? There's elements of social networks. There's a concept, a phrase coined in sociology years ago called emotional labor. And as you move from factories to services and knowledge workers, more what we do involves dealing with difficult people, controlling our emotions, sometimes upregulating, like, wow, this, if you work in Hollywood, you have to pretend everything is the greatest thing ever until you get a chance to stab people in the back. And so and as we deal with more complicated abstract types of work, it's not clear these emotional things are like second order and they disappear. It could be quite the other way around. It seems like I don't think anything in traditional behavioral economics has much to say about this immediately. It's more like there are ideas from psychology and cognitive neuroscience and elsewhere that may have something to say about the nature of work that kind of expands and fills out the picture. The second thing is advertising. So the current analysis of advertising economics is three things. It's signaling money. If you can afford to put up ads, it means your company's going to do really well. And the main prediction from that is that companies should brag about how expensive the ads are. I actually made an advertisement in Japan, and I'm not allowed contractually to say how much I was paid. So the one prediction of the theory doesn't seem to be right.
No, that's because you weren't paid enough. Follows from your earlier work.
For the emotional labor. It was pretty good. The second theory is kind of a more interesting one, is that the content of the ads is conveying information. And that's true for newspaper ads for used cars. But the lion's share of advertising is much more vague, and it often creates associations and images, and it doesn't seem to have to do with watching a truck drive around the Utah Valley, bouncing up and down. That's not really information you need to know, because you're not going to be driving that truck in that way for the most part. So it leaves, and then there are other views. In fact, Gary and Kevin Murphy have a paper on this where they just say, look, the advertising is just a complement to the production of the good. Like, it just shifts demand in some way. And as a reduced form idea, that's pretty interesting. But it doesn't say much about content of advertising or who may be more advertising sensitive. And I think that's something in which economic forces are at play. So a purely psychological analysis is not going to tell you about equilibrium advertising levels. But you might be able to say something about the content of ads and other things, as well as relevant policy questions like advertising to children. What everyone thinks is probably appalling, and we have a lot of rules about advertising to children. Why? And like they turn 12, do they suddenly develop this bullshit detector? Maybe.
No, they lose it. That's...
Oh yeah. So anything that would inform policy, it would be helpful to have a little more sophisticated concept of who's able to sort of understand ads and not be manipulated or anything like that. And by the way, these things do get debated, but it's often typically by lawyers and sometimes child psychologists. And I'm not saying it's a huge area that economists have something dramatic to say, but it seems like a lot of economic tools and a little bit of psychology would help us say more about that.
So I think the thing that's going to just turn everything upside down is biology. And I'm really excited for your generation. We are on the threshold of an extraordinary revolution in social science as we begin a 100-year period of unraveling the biological mechanisms, which we barely understand. I mean, today we have the faintest glimmer of insight into these mechanisms, but the tools are there, and they are developing very rapidly. And I think over your research careers, and I hope many of you will have such careers, it's gonna be explosive. And when you think about how much predictive power will come from genetics, from neural measurements, from epigenetics, from the interaction of all of these forces with environmental factors, it's just going to transform the way we think about the world and transform all sorts of deep questions of who we are and issues of fertility and all sorts of complex, very problematic, fascinating and terrifying questions. So I really sit on the one hand excited, on the other hand fearful of the knowledge that we will obtain in the next 50 years as we dig and uncover more and more of these biological mechanisms.
We were thinking of asking whether you think Gary Becker and Adam Smith are behavioral economists, but you've already answered that question in the affirmative. So I'm interested in, Professor Kammerer, your allusion to Milton Friedman, who's obviously a legend here. Would you guys go so far as to say that his as-if statement, which I have in one phrasing here, is essentially that using rationality is the only way we can impose some intellectual order on the complexities of economic life, and the assumption of rational behavior has been particularly fruitful as a simplification? Would you say that his work is still in line with behavioral economics because now with this revolution, as you say, in having new insights, we no longer need the simplification that Friedman proposed, and he would accept
I agree
that.
with the second statement, but not the first. And again, it may be, things change. So the data available were really sparse, and the ability to think about what's inside the brain or to decode the genome, what really was very much science fiction at that point. I will add that I think I learned this from David, actually, that in thinking about the consumption function, Friedman talked about how he thought that a 3-year planning horizon was really the natural way people made consumption decisions.
Yeah, 5.
5?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, 5.
Not 75.
And, that's a very behavioral claim, right? That there's a sort of natural limit to planning. And empirically, I don't know if 5 would hold up or not. It might be much more kind of context dependent, where sometimes people are just looking a week ahead. And sometimes when they're sitting down with their financial planner because they had to, because the company made them do it, they actually have some spreadsheet and they're doing things which may actually be influential 40 years ahead. So, you can imagine that the 5 is like a geometric average of a lot of different forces. And again, technologically, most of which have emerged, only recently. So you can hardly fault Friedman for not being much more prescient on that.
So I would, they were both giants completely, and Becker for his incredible openness to and insistence on expanding the range of thinking. And Friedman, it's very complex. It's a very complex figure. He was incredibly insightful. He lay at the origin, in part, of dynamic programming. I don't know if you know that. But you can read the book by Abraham Wald that launched dynamic programming, and you'll see that he thanks Milton Friedman, who was at that point, I think, a graduate student up at the University of Upper Columbia. So, but his economics, he's known as much for a type of pragmatic empiricism. He didn't believe, this is what Colin's alluding to and what David's alluding to. He didn't say kind of the model is everything. And he had some fierce debates with people who were, quote, more model-based than he and loved general equilibrium theory. And he liked the Marshallian fish market. So he liked a vision that in which you could tell a story more tightly and believe in it. And his consumption function is to this day kind of a highlight in applied economics. So I think that, but then again, that means that if there had been richer data, one can be sure that he would have been very deeply engaged in it. A monetary history isn't a bad piece of work. So all honor, no, delighted to claim any association I can.
So Becker and Friedman are two of the people I admire most in my history as an economist. They were both geniuses. They both transformed the world for the better. They both transformed economic science for the better. But one doesn't need to believe that literally everything they wrote was exactly right. We are learning as we go. And while I admire them probably as much as I admire anyone in the history of economics, sure, in retrospect, they probably emphasized kind of classical rationality too much. And we're now realizing that stepping back a little bit from that extreme position is fruitful. And that's not any criticism of them. In their time, the critical move, the key move, the important move, was to take us from a world where we were modeling people as kind of mechanistic and stupid and myopic, and recognize that there was far more rationality and far more purposefulness and far more sophistication in their choices. They corrected an imbalance that was very grave, or let's say 100 years ago. And I'm grateful to them for moving the profession in that direction. Did they get everything exactly right? And can we go back and kind of revisit every word they wrote and say, yes, it was perfect? No, of course not. Were they geniuses, and did they advance our science in enormous ways? Yes.
Great. We want to talk about some of the empirical methods of behavioral econ. Professor Kammerer, you've already emphasized that behavioralists have to value predictive formal models, yet behavioral econ is sometimes categorically criticized for promoting empirical findings that lack external validity. For example, lab experiments which have students imitate investment bankers' activities may not speak to professional bankers' behaviors, and field experiments which find, for example, that farmers in one town fail to save for fertilizer don't generalize to other towns. So we're wondering, in what ways do you each think that an experiment, in order to be valuable, must be generalizable? And then by your standards, is it fair to say that behavioral econ has an external validity problem?
It does not have an external validity problem.
No is the answer to the last question. Next.
Next? All right, I'll try to be brief on this. So the term external validity was coined by Julian Stanley and Don Campbell in 1963. I knew Julian Stanley very well. He was an educational psychologist. And what they had in mind, their book was really a recipe book for people doing education experiments and other types of experiments at that time. And I think people urged them to write these things down because there wasn't a kind of handbook for how you do a good experiment, and they were trying to be as practical as possible. So the idea of internal validity was that if you think there's a causal treatment variable that's been applied correctly, it passes a manipulation check. An instrumental variable we would think has to satisfy some exclusion restriction or some similar property. So it's internal validity applies to other. There are ways of testing internal validity for non-lab causal claims that came later. External validity is really different. I think what they had in mind was, if I work in a school district and I read your papers, you're going to work in my school district. And it would be useful to have an index of that, like in the paper itself. But most of what we do in experimental economics, for sure, is not of that type. So I distinguish between kind of a scientific approach, which means, is a particular lab experiment tell us something about the general principles which govern socioeconomic and political behavior in the world? And it's kind of silly to say a particular experiment has high external validity or low external validity, because there's a huge vector of properties of the experiment: who's in it, how much they know, how much they're paid, what major they are, genetics, and then there are a lot of other vectors of properties of markets and decisions and things going on the planet Earth, some of which will match up and some of which won't. So could you generate an external validity function? No, you can't. So I don't like to use that term. I think in terms of something you might think of as like a generalizability function or generalizability map. Like after you do your experiment, give me a kind of an idea of what types of markets and people and things it would likely extend to best and would likely not extend to. And once you think in those terms, and by the way, people don't typically do this very explicitly, but sometimes kind of along the way or in response to a referee or something like that. But once you think about it that way, the external thing makes no difference, because as you pointed out, even a field experiment or an empirical test with shoppers in California or tourists in Iceland may have limited external validity, even though it's not a lab experiment. So don't just criticize lab experiments for this type of external validity. It's really generalizability of a particular empirical finding from one domain to others. And I'd prefer to think of it as where do we expect it to work well and not work well, rather than try to map it into some crude idea about external validity or not. And to circle back to my first point, no, we don't have an external validity problem. Here's what I mean, which is there are about 30 or 40 studies that have compared a lab-derived measure of, say, individual behavior, like how generous you are in a game, or how risk-averse you seem to be when I ask you about monetary gambles, or how patient you are in waiting for money. And then you correlate those with some naturally occurring behavior we can measure pretty well. Like, do you smoke? Do you own a lot of stocks and bonds? Do you give to charity outside of the lab? And the correlations between the lab and field behaviors are typically 0.2 to 0.5, which is about what you'd expect for, and probably field-to-field behaviors are not that much higher. Right, so it isn't just that the lab doesn't point to the field, it's that the field may not map to the field, which means there's not the field, that there's different domains, and we need something more like a similarity function mentality. And the last part of my claim, no, we have no external validity problem, is there's been, to my knowledge, about 6 or 7 experiments that started with a field setting and then tried to match a lab experiment as closely as possible, like the same subjects doing a very similar thing, And only one of them showed a really substantial, solid statistical difference, which was an interesting experiment in Holland. In Holland, you can go to a big lake, and you can pay money, and they take your money and they put some fish in the lake. That doesn't guarantee that you catch them. So there's a free rider problem, right? I paid for these fish for us, but there's no way I can keep you from catching my fish and vice versa. And it turns out that in that situation, people aren't very pro-social. They catch each other's fish. But when you take the same fishermen and bring them into a lab experiment and you say, would you contribute to money to a public good that would help other people, they contribute to a public good. And even then, you can say, well, but, you know, there's a context specificity. Nobody expects to be, you know, laying off of your neighbor's fish, and it may be even hard to do it technically, you know, unless they're marked in some way. So that's the biggest difference, where you see people clearly not very pro-social in one setting, and the same people in a lab setting being quite pro-social. And even then, you might be perfectly comfortable saying, well, of course, I don't necessarily think this extent of human pro-sociality is completely domain independent. So you might be comfortable with a case like that. And in most of the other cases where people have tried to carefully match lab and field, either there's not enough data to really be able to say very clearly, or the matches are okay.
I've changed my mind. Since I'm with friends, I decided I'd confess to something, which is it's not that behavioral economics has an external validity problem. It's that economics has an external validity problem. Now, I sometimes, when I'm feeling like I want to depress myself, I watch a video of Richard Feynman explaining how science works. And he says, what you do is you make assumptions, follow through to the conclusions, and if the conclusions don't agree with experiment, you're wrong. So I wish I could say that. I wish that economics was a field that enabled us to do that. And I kind of crave that and long for it. I think that the reason that we're still not there in so many ways is that if you think about the forces that we think are playing out in even the simplest decision, there were 76 of them. I mean, like, I was thinking this, but subconsciously I probably was thinking a little differently, but then I didn't notice that over there, but I thought I might offend you over here. All of that played out, and then you said, hi. Think of the problem of inferring what was going on in your head in that decision. Economics can't do better than that. It's not that we've got to tease out as much as we can about the decisions. Now, in a way, again, going to my kind of, well, it's a process, so try and tease out more to learn more. But if we don't do that, we'll keep going back to the well, and our last theory will turn out not to have been so right because we were neglecting 400,000 of the other forces at play. There is, that said, there are some beautiful forces at work, which seem to be things like, well, that was expensive, I'm not buying it. That's one of them. There are forces that cut through. I think that behavioral economics has found some of them. I mean, the fact that you can manipulate choices so strangely with, would you mind please making a choice? You say, what do you mean? Like, no, you do notice that this is a choice and you have to make it. You say, okay, well, I knew that. And then just having told you that, your choice is different. That's another interesting force at play. It's valid. It happens all the time. So I think we're all in this together in the sense that the field needs to contemplate data enrichment much more and the limits of what we can learn from the limits of what we measure. And if behavioral economics is part of telling us to measure more as well as model more, then that's just part of the advance of the field.
So I agree that behavioral economics has an external validity problem, and so does economics, and in fact, so does all of social science. We are all in it, and a lot of the last 5 years has been very depressing in recognizing how much of what was a canonical finding anywhere in social science has a hard time replicating. So I think we should all take very seriously the critique that not everything that is in the textbook actually will replicate, even in a very well-designed experiment that's just the same, let alone in a different setting where we're really stretching the concept and applying it to something that is very external. But there's lots of solutions for that, and happily the profession is adopting them very rapidly. What are the solutions? Well, the first thing is, do you all know what p-hacking is? Have you heard of p-hacking? That's kind of, you're running regression after regression after regression, changing the variables, omitting outliers, making a log transformation, not making a log transformation, doing it until you finally get a t-stack greater than 1.96. And then you say, aha, success, and you publish the paper. Well, we know what that is. That's garbage. That's nonsense. That won't replicate. And miraculously, for about 50 years, a lot of people went about their work that way. And they reported the result that was successful after running 150 regressions. And we're learning that we just absolutely can't do that. That is the path to nonsense. We're pulling back from that. Where some of us are pre-registering our studies. Now, I don't think everyone needs to follow that path, but there's more and more effort to say ahead of time, before you've run one regression, I am going to put it in black and white, I'm going to put it in an archive, and I'm going to hold myself to this set of analyses so that I commit publicly not to p-hack. It's another thing that we're doing, and I think it's progress. Not that, again, everyone has to do that, but I think more and more of us should do that. Then there's just recognizing the benefits of big data sets. I mean, a lot of the results that don't replicate were these 40-person studies in 4 arms, 10-person arms. We shouldn't be surprised that when you have small effect sizes and tiny samples, often you end up with false positives that get published in good journals. Well, we're more and more skeptical of those really small samples, and we should be more and more eager to go after the large sample studies ourselves as we go out and do research. And then finally, of course, the most important thing that we're doing now is replicating and demonstrating when, and this comes back to what Colin said, you have to, sometimes it will replicate to a new setting, sometimes it won't. And we're learning about all of those contingencies. And we've got to be aggressive in valuing and pursuing all of these replication studies and not just kind of dismissing that as something trivial. Because frankly, half the time we discover that the well-known result, that's a classic textbook result, is so fragile that when we change even the slightest ingredient, we don't get it. So I think we've got a lot of tools that we're using because we all recognize that social science has an external validity and an internal validity problem as well.
Yeah, let me say one self-promoting thing about that. So David's right. Probably some of the biggest problems involving p-hacking were first called attention to in medicine, where the stakes are very high, although pre-registration has also been the norm for a long while, and in areas of psychology. But psychology has also really turned on a dime. So I think they've been very self-correcting about encouraging replication. Anyway, and so in collaboration with some group of people like that, we did the first replication of laboratory experiments in economics. So we took 18 experiments in the AER and the QJE. They weren't typically behavioral economics experiments per se. A lot of them were things about if you pay people this in a particular contract, they'll exert more effort. Or if you play a prisoner's dilemma with more periods, you'll get more cooperation. It was a mixture of sort of very typical, interesting results. And they replicated fairly well, although about 4 really failed to replicate out of 18, and we would have expected something like 10%, like 2 out of 18. So it was a little worse than one would absolutely hope. But the main thing was that the effect sizes were pretty big. So an original study said, well, when you do the experiment this way, things are different by 0.9. The effect we got was, say, like 0.6. So things were moving in the right direction, but there was a little bit of either regression or some kind of movement. The other thing, the reason I'm taking the time to plug this, it was in Science this year. It took about 1 year to do. Grant agencies literally begged, but they made it clear that they were very happy to give us money once we had told them what we were going to do after we'd done the planning. And it was published in Science, whose editor emailed me twice to say, have you done with that project yet? When the editor of Science emails you to say, are you done with that project yet? First of all, hurry up. And second, that's good news. And so previous to this recent wave of interest in reproducibility and kind of proactive doing something about it, the view was it doesn't pay professionally to do a replication. The original author may get mad at you. If it doesn't replicate, they're going to be really mad at you. It's hard to get it published. You don't establish that you're an original creative thinker if you're a grad student. But I think the answer is that there is an audience for sets of replications. And in addition, if you're a first or second year lab student at Caltech, probably what I'll have you do in the future is a replication of somebody else's work. Because you can still learn a fair amount about how to do an experiment without some of the headaches and tears. And again, that won't be in your thesis as a major chapter because it doesn't show how clever an economist you are. But there is money and journal space available to produce some of these results, at least until we get a better kind of census or audit of what's going on, and are some methods better than others.
I also want to make a little bit of a, maybe mildly provocative about anybody who would say you shouldn't be using the experimental lab because that's like not real people doing real stuff. Why don't we say that about physics? Like, there's strange particles under weird controlled conditions doing like weird stuff. They don't do that out there. I mean,
The Large Hadron Collider.
so the idea that we don't want the control in economics because it's what, so easy? We need 1,000 controls in economics. We need more controls. If you want to isolate forces, why should it be easier in economics than it is in physics? Why should that be easier? So the careful design of an experiment to isolate forces is extremely important.
But along with the field, I mean, you're advocating both, right?
Well, I was done talking about the lab right there. That's what I was talking about.
But would you endorse the view that we should have both lab experiments and field experiments, or do you think
Not in the same sentence that I'm talking about lab experiments. So I was absolutely talking about the extra control that the lab gives you. When you step into the field, there are tremendous advantages. You can say, I believe that this behavior is, as it were, more general. The issue is you're losing lots of degrees of control over what exactly the people were doing. In an experiment in the lab, I can actually literally see what you were looking at, and I've got it down, and that was nice. Lots of these experiments will really get very tight insight into the type of information search somebody did. The time you took to decide, yes, I can see you really were taking that time to decide. Let's go into the field. What were you doing? You wandered away, you put the kettle on. I don't know what you were doing. That was the time you took to decide. No, it wasn't. It was the time you took to have an argument with the cat. I mean, I don't know. So I like the control, and then I very much believe that it should, I mean, if it's going to be valid, you're going to be taking it many other places.
Okay, we'd like to move on to some pre-selected questions from the audience. So I'll read out your name, and then if you could just stand up and wait for the microphone to come to you before you start speaking. So first, we have a question from Kevin Guo. Is Kevin, okay.
So Professor Kammerer, you briefly mentioned price bubbles. On the policy side, should central bankers think about the behavioral impacts of their forward guidance statements and how they might influence asset bubbles?
Probably, but it's probably premature in the sense that if Janet Yellen, also known as Ms. George Akerlof, or the way around, she's the chair of the Fed, and George Akerlof is he's a macroeconomist who's either an honorary or a precursor behavioral economist. He brought a lot of ideas, actually often from sociology rather than psychology, to bear. And if people in the Fed were to say, what do we know about bubbles that would help us say something about the influence of forward guidance on bubbles if they exist, I don't think we're very far along to be able to say much about that. I mean, I think we could have a probably lively 1-hour conversation, but it's something which we've only begun to really understand just a little bit experimentally. And field data is tricky too, because bubbles are easily seen in retrospect and hard in foresight. So it's a very messy empirical area.
what's new in neuroscience that behavioral economists should pay attention to, should know about. And the focused version of that, what one or two papers in the last 5 years are the most important? Could be theory, could be empirical finding or fact, could be methods.
Are you looking to confirm self-serving bias? Okay. Okay.
I think the big three topics that are going to influence economics are emotion, the concept of habit, a kind of neurobiologically centered concept of habit, similar to what Andy was talking about as thoughtlessness, overlapping, and a certain amount of reconfiguration about how we think about time preference as related to imagination, which is actually similar to what you're working on, although you may not agree, but well, I've been thinking about it. The basic idea about time preference is that if you lesion a rat's hippocampus, for example, they become extremely impatient. And that's a clue that hippocampus, which we used to think of as a memory consolidation, memory recall storehouse, is actually important for thinking about the future. And waiting the future is thinking about the future. And so I think this is going to help us make sense of a lot of puzzling anomalous facts about the nature of time preference. And so there's some emerging, a paper by Peters and Buchel in 2010, which I think has got replicated pretty solidly, about hippocampal activity involved in thinking about the future. Another way to put it is, there's evidence for something you might think of as an imagination network or a perspective thinking network. And that's the network that's going to control how much weight we put on future events. And habit I can say a lot more about. I think that the killer paper, it's a little bit inside baseball, is by Lee, O'Doherty, and Shimojo in 2014. And they have a particular, very kind of control theoretic way almost of thinking about a system that operates on habit and on thoughtful deliberation. You know, deliberation is hard and slow, so you want to actually, habits are good as long as they're not leading to mistakes. And so the idea is a model in which you have this habitual outsourcing, but you also need some kind of a reliability signal to tell you, wait a minute, this habit led to really bad mistakes. I need to rethink, like executive function, come in, we need to override the habit and start over. And you can write down a kind of computational model of this. The model does not have optimization in it, although it could. Some very clever person could say, if there were some constraints and a particular choice environment, how would I design a system that would toggle between rapid repeating what happened in the fast and stopping, interrupting, and rethinking, resetting because things are different. And so I think that's going to, get a huge amount of traction. Fortunately, the areas in which behavioral economics have really flourished is where we had something new to say that stubbornly, we eventually convinced people was important, like maybe loss aversion, and where we didn't have anything brand new to say, but which we were able to deliver some new insights. Like the concept of habit is in William James and in clinical psychology and in Campbell and Cochran's model of macro finance preferences and in Becker and Murphy. And so, nobody's hostile to the concept of habit. It's just a question of what do the details look like, and can we say something new and exciting? And I think the neuroscience is going to give us some really powerful weapons.
So I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy. The one that I've focused on, the one that I think is going to come up a lot, has to do with dopamine. And dopamine is, and that's because within neuroscience, maybe the best understood theory, and it's a beautiful theory, is the reward prediction error theory of dopaminergic response. And the connection between reward prediction errors and learning is clearly there. There's no question there are different styles of learning depending on how the dopamine system is operating. And you have things like Nathaniel Dawes experiments on supervised and unsupervised learning. I worked with Mark Dean and we've worked with Paul Glimcher on confirming that there is a beautiful theory which Wolfram Schultz and Reed Montague and Peter Dayan are responsible for, of the reward prediction error theory, which doubtless a Nobel Prize in physiology will go for, which says that we have a system in us that is waiting to see how good something is, predicting it, and goes off like a bell when something was better than we'd anticipated and goes very down when something is worse than anticipated, is seen as a key part of many addictive processes. And so what's going on there, which is really very interesting and why that kind of keeps advancing, is the theory's in place, the measurements are in place, we know where to measure, and in ongoing work on smoking, we're finding that with David Cesarini, Dan Benjamin, Kevin Tom, and Patrick Turley. So David's very much implicated in training everybody and is involved in this. We're finding that one of the reasons that there are genetic links to addictive behavior that seem to go through indirectly the neurotransmitters. So if you were to look at a Becker-Murphy model of addiction, some of the parameters in those preferences have biological origin, if you want to do it in the crudest, most mechanical way, but the best way for making a policy conclusion. So what we're going to find increasingly is that in area after area, the behavior is informed by the biology. The biology very probably has a strong neural flavor. Whether it's the bio or the neuroscience that's winning there, I can't tell. But they're interacting with the behavior and driving something. And in a time in which many of the major problems that you have as a society have to do with choices that look like an outsider would surely not make them for you, why are you making, why stuff that food in? Those kind of things, I think we're going to be finding ourselves studying those biological mechanisms and their neural aspects very heavily.
So the work that I have found the most stimulating in the last few years is the work on genome-wide association studies. And let me quickly paint the picture here. 10, 15 years ago, the thinking was that if we identified a candidate biological process and we identified the genetic variants associated with that candidate process, we could look for associations between that candidate genetic variant and some interesting economic behavior. And that approach has essentially failed. And what has replaced it is something called a genome-wide association study. And that essentially is a sort of non-parametric approach where you look across the common variants in the genome and you look for associations across, say, 1 million sites and economic behaviors of interest. And that approach has borne fruit in the medical literature, and it's now bearing fruit in the economics literature. And that approach is also helping us to think about heritability. And I believe that this new GWAS approach, a lot of the most important analysis is coming out of Peter Vischer's lab in Queensland, is going to really transform social science. It's essentially a movement from a world in which we thought we knew what we were doing by kind of pre-guessing what the right neurotransmitter was or pre-guessing the right genetic variant was, to a world in which we're much more agnostic. We are much more willing to be open to the idea that all of these different biological pathways play minuscule roles in influencing behavior. But when you add up 10,000 of those pathways, you end up getting a lot of explained variants. Typically, we find that additive models of these individual genetic variants components produce R-squared's cross-sectional variance of about 20% as a minimum. So you have enormous explanatory power from this method relative to standard social science variables. And I think that method's going to, it already, you'll see in Science and Nature, you see paper after paper studying biomedical outcomes, and now you see paper after paper studying social science outcomes, and also pathologies in the overlap, like schizophrenia. So whether you're talking about schizophrenia or depression or happiness, a recent paper in Nature Genetics, or educational attainment, the paper I told you about in Nature, we're kind of we're seeing the first wave of research that's kind of unpacking these genetic pathways that are extremely complex given the number of different genetic associations, each of which has a very small effect size. But I think for me, that's the work that has completely changed my worldview in the last few years.
If I could just follow, because it in fact is, we're using GWAS methods, and the thing is you do sometimes find something that literally it wasn't found in the candidate gene search. But the fact is that there's something called Mr. Big in smoking. There's a particular genetic effect, there's Mr. Big, and Mr. Big actually goes through the dopaminergic response to nicotine. So you get back to a theory, which then does associate back with particular neural structures. So we're not alone in wanting there ultimately to be some theory that you could hang around the effects. But we're in the very earliest days of this interaction. I think both David and I, kind of like talking about, and Colin too, we're all talking about how the bio interaction with our field is, I guess we're kind of saying it's a profound frontier.
Great. It's very exciting. A lot of great research being done and a lot to look forward to. That is the end of our time tonight. So we want to thank the audience for those questions and for attending tonight. We hope you all had a nice time. Final thank you to the BFI for helping us organize this panel. And thank you very, very much to all of our panelists for coming.
Thank you.